Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, friends. As Joe said, this is the last talk in the series, and we will do a little summary of what has been said so far and try to see the whole subject from a general perspective. The idea of the purpose of life or the meaning of life is one of the subjects that has received most thought and debate both in the world of philosophy and religion. Why are we here? What's the purpose of being alive? This question was answered, or the attempt to answer the question was made from many different points of view. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, the general idea is that the purpose of life is to follow the will of God. And that is good enough, but what we are asking here is something that is a little more fundamental. And the idea is, why do we incarnate at all? You know, once we are incarnated, once we have a body, then the purpose of life may be to follow the will of God, that was the creator, from the point of view of Christianity. But why are we incarnated in the first place? Because God creates a soul. This soul is per se eternal. And then this soul is sent to be incarnated for a very brief time, a period of time. If you compare the 100 years that we are alive with eternity, it's not even an instant. So what's the purpose? Why would God do that? Just for the purpose of testing the soul that he or she created? Well, in Christianity, just for the purpose of testing the soul that he created to see if it is good enough to spend the rest of eternity in heaven or send it to hell. What is the need to be incarnated? He could have created the soul and the soul just lived there in heaven. As far as I know, I have never encountered an explanation at that level. Why are we alive at all? On the physical plane, because the soul is beyond death and birth. So when I say why are we alive, I'm not saying why do we exist. I'm saying why are we alive with a physical body? That is not, in principle, is not necessary for the soul. The Gnostics, who were one of the first Christian communities at the beginning of our era, they were aware of this problem. So their view was different from the view that became the accepted view in Christianity a few centuries later. They said, well, actually being alive with a physical body is pretty much a mistake. It's not what was intended. It was never intended. It's a result of the creation of a demigod, a pseudo-god, who himself was the result of a mistake, because they have the idea of Sophia, one of the eons, as they call them, angels, let's say. In Gnosticism, they generate or create things by pairs, a male and female pair. Sophia was a female counterpart of the Christ. And for some reason, Sophia decides to generate a god by herself. And this God, because it was generated only by herself, was flawed. He wasn't a spiritual, or didn't have a spiritual perception. And in turn, this demigod created human beings that were this bag of skin and bones without any divine spark. And then Sophia had to come to the rescue and put a divine spark so that human beings could get free from the physical world that was a prison. So in the Gnostic view, the physical world is just a prison. We are here, and the purpose of being, or the purpose of life, if anything, is just to escape from life, to escape from this prison. So Christ is our helper in trying to get liberated. Now, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the approach is not very different. In their view, life is also the result of a mistake. Not so much a mistake made by an extra cosmic God, but a mistake of perception. We keep incarnating. In their view, there is this process of reincarnation. So we keep taking a body once and again because we think we are the body, because we desire the things that belong to the body, to the emotions, to the mind, to what we call myself. So there is a law which brings whatever we desire. So if we desire material things, we as souls may not get them in one particular life. But all that desire is a karmic cause that has to be exhausted, has to produce its effect. So for that, a new physical incarnation is needed so that we can receive the results of everything that we desire. But of course, when we are incarnated again, we have more desires, and that generates more and more lives. So there is a cycle from which, again, we have to break free. So the general view in Hinduism and Buddhism is that we have to develop wisdom, we have to try to get rid of desire, because that is the way in which we can stop producing karmic causes that will bring us again to the physical world. When we attain that, we reach moksha. Moksha means liberation. So liberation from the circle of incarnation. So again, what is the purpose of being alive? It's pretty much trying to see how to stop being alive again with a physical body. The soul is eternal, and the incarnation on the physical plane is, as I said, a result of a wrong perception. When the Theosophical Society was founded in 1875, a different perspective was brought, different for the time. I mean, the Theosophical Society carries on the tradition of, for example, the Neoplatonists. The Neoplatonists were Greek philosophers that followed the teachings of Plato and Pythagoras, and they would say, well, actually, everything that happens in the universe is governed by laws, not mechanical laws as we are used to think of laws today. You know, with the development of science, we tend as a culture to think that the universe is this kind of clock, and there are physical laws, chemical laws, and they are mechanical, and they keep the universe going on. For the ancient Greeks, the laws were just the expression of an intelligence that was the logos. Logos means reason or means word, not necessarily a God, an embodied God, but a universal mind. So they would say all the laws are the expression of this universal mind, and therefore they cannot be wrong. There cannot be a fundamental mistake in the universe. There may be mistakes here and there that nature corrects, but not fundamentally. So being alive cannot be pretty much a mistake. There has to be a purpose. So the Theosophical Society, following this tradition, presents to the modern world a different approach. And this was a completely different approach to what normally people from different religions believe. Now, if you dig deep enough in the different religions, you will see traces of this particular view. In what is called the more esoteric interpretation of religions, you can see that this idea was there. But the general interpretation, or in the general knowledge, this idea was lost. And if we put it in a nutshell, is the idea that there is a spiritual evolution, that there is some transformation that goes on at the level of the soul. And this is why we are incarnated. Later on with Aurobindo, for example, he was a Hindu sage, and he restated this idea of spiritual evolution in Hinduism. And today, a good number of Hindus believe in the idea of spiritual evolution, but as I said, that was not present at the time. So let us see from the theosophical view what is this evolution about, why it is necessary, and what is the reason for the experience of living. In the previous talks, we talked about the experience of health and illness. What's the meaning of this in life? The experience of suffering. Why do we suffer? And the experience of happiness. What is happiness? So let us explore these things from the point of view of what the process of evolution needs to be accomplished. So the theosophical idea is that everything begins from the one. There is one consciousness, and that one consciousness at the beginning of the universe is one. There is nothing outside that consciousness. Now, one aspect of that consciousness is what we would call matter. Not matter, the physical matter only. Matter in the sense of substance. From a philosophical point of view, substance is not necessarily, as I said, something physical, but a basis that is modified and that produces diversity. So, for example, you could say gold is a substance which can be molded into different forms, but the substance itself remains the same. So, one aspect of this one consciousness is this very spiritual substance which is modified and produces all different levels of matter. The densest, the grossest aspect of matter is what we call physical matter. But in the theosophical view, there is also an emotional matter. You know, our emotions are not merely subjective states that happen within us, but they are also a field. They have a certain energy, and that energy always needs matter to move. You know, today quantum physics and even the relativity of Einstein has seen that matter and energy are two aspects of the same principle. So the idea is that there is an emotional energy, which is a kind of substance, a kind of matter, which some people who are clairvoyant can actually see when they say that they see the aura. There is a mental matter, and there are different levels, spiritual kinds of matter. So the idea is that before that substance differentiates into the different kinds of matter in the universe, this one consciousness, which normally in theosophy following the Greeks is called the Logos, that universal mind, not, as I said, not necessarily an embodied God, it's something much more abstract, but we can think of it as a divine entity. This Logos, before producing the cosmos, produces little centers of consciousness. Now, when we explain all this, we have to remember that we are talking allegorically. It's very difficult it's probably impossible to speak of these things that happen in a spiritual world or dimension that has very little to do with the physical. It's very difficult to speak about that dimension through the words that we have created to describe physical things. Even something as simple as the idea that matter is solid and impenetrable, that is not true in the next state of matter, which is sometimes called astral matter. That doesn't apply even to the next state, and there are, in the theosophical view, 7 states of matter. So all the words we have are very insufficient to really understand what we are talking about. But that is why most religions and traditions talk in myths, because the myths are like a little story which symbolically represents what is actually going on. It's like if you have to explain chemistry to a little child. You cannot explain, for example, that the molecule of water is these atoms of hydrogen and oxygen and the orbitals with the electrons. So if you have to explain it, you say, well, the hydrogen has only one hand and the oxygen has two, and then he grabs, one hydrogen here, one here, and that's water, H2O. So is that wrong? No, it's not wrong, but it's the only way he can understand it. So when we study these things, it's not too different from that. We have to explain it in our own language. So bear with me with this explanation, always keeping in mind that it's far more abstract and metaphysical. But let's say this one consciousness, for some reason, it seems that reproduction is how nature works. Everything tends to reproduce itself. So the Logos also, at the beginning of a cosmos, one of the aims of generating a cosmos is to generate new centers of consciousness, which eventually will become logoi. Logoi is a plural for logos. Will become new logos, each one of these centers of consciousness. Eventually means eons of evolution. Now, how do you generate something separate in something that is a unity? For example, if you have water and the water is perfectly still, you need to produce, if you want to have something separate, you need to produce like a disturbance in the water. Suppose a whirlpool. A whirlpool is like a disturbance in the water, and now you have something that you can say, you can identify, this is a whirlpool, as opposed to just the water. It's just water, but it's water that is behaving in a particular way, and that sets it apart from the rest of the water. So in the case of the one consciousness, it also generates little whirlpools, if you want. And those are like the seeds of consciousness that are our spirits. Those seeds of consciousness, because they come from, or they are the Logos, they have all the same potentialities of the Logos. It's just like a seed has a potentiality of becoming a tree. But the seed is not a tree right away. There is a process of development. So this process of generating this whirlpool implies a wrapping up. Suppose there is the center of consciousness, which is just the Logos, but it wraps itself up in all the different kinds of matter that are generated in the universe. So we could say there is the spiritual matter, there is mental matter, emotional matter, physical matter. So as the center of consciousness gets these envelopes or these vestures of matter, the consciousness that is inside gets more and more obscured and gets blinded by matter. Now this consciousness, remember, is essentially, it has a potentiality of the Logos, but it has to awaken all those potentialities. Now, why would that center of consciousness need to wrap itself in all these kinds of matter? We could say, well, that center of consciousness could be wrapped only with the subtlest of all the matter and stay as a spirit, because wrapping itself in physical matter means to be incarnated with a physical body. So why does it happen? If this center of consciousness is going to become a Logos, eventually, the idea of the Logos is that it is a consciousness that pervades all kinds of matter in the universe. Because this Logos, this universal mind, is the intelligence that is behind the whole universe, pervading physical matter, the trees, the minerals, ourselves, and also the emotional, the mental, all the dimensions of the universe. So this little center of consciousness has to learn to express itself through physical matter, through emotional, mental, and all the different kinds of matter. So it is necessary for this consciousness to be embodied and to create a little cosmos. It is always said that human beings are like a microcosmos of the macrocosmos. We are a little universe in the sense that all the forces that are there in the cosmos are part of a human being. Now, we are dormant to most of these forces, to most of these faculties. But the process of evolution consists in awakening those faculties. It's just like what happens with a baby. The mind of a baby has all the potentialities of the mind of an adult. But it's not the mind of an adult. In the baby, the mind is unconscious. So it needs to be woken up. Through the interaction with the environment, little by little, that consciousness that is within begins to respond to the environment, to more and more complex stimulus. And then as it responds to the environment, it begins to awaken all these potentialities that are in him. So in the same way, this consciousness of the Logos begins to experience the world and to respond to the world, and little by little begins to develop all the faculties that we know in a human being, and even more, because at this point in evolution we only know the faculties of a normal human being. But there are many yogis, saints, prophets, that they show many other faculties that seem miraculous. It seems that they can perform miracles. Well, from the theosophical point of view, it's not a miracle. Everything that happens is part of the laws of nature. It's only that those faculties are dormant in normal human beings. But in the process of evolution, they will wake up. But the idea here is, this is why we have a physical body along with an emotional and mental body and all that. Now, this brings a problem, because in the same way that the baby, for example, the baby begins to wake up through external stimuli. So the consciousness of the baby begins to pay attention to the outside. And that's the reason why in humanity today, for example, we can explain what happens with the infinitesimal parts of the atom, with things that last so little that is inconceivable by our minds. You break a second in a million parts, and one of these little parts is what a quark, for example, lasts. And we can study it, and we can name it, and we can describe it, and then we can go to almost the beginning of the Big Bang, to the creation of the physical universe. We have done amazing things in the external world, but we have no clue about our internal world. We don't know how to deal with our mind, with our emotions. We don't know who we really are. Why is that? We are so clever, so amazingly clever in studying the world, and we don't know who we are. That's because our consciousness is awakened by the external, and it just begins to, this always reminds me of the metaphor that the myth that I was telling you, the Gnostic myth. You know, this demigod, when he was created by Sophia, he was a lower demigod, and he awakens or wakes up, and he sees an empty universe, and he says, hey, nobody's here, I'm God. I'm the God of the universe. Let us create angels and planets and this and that. And he was unable to perceive whatever was higher. Sophia was there. His mother was there along with him, but he was unable to perceive what was higher. So in the same way, our consciousness that has been awakened by the external seems to be unable to perceive the internal. We need to undergo a process to be able to perceive the internal. So in this process of perceiving the external, consciousness begins to identify itself with the body. Because, for example, the baby is hungry, and what consciousness perceives is this body being hungry. And then the baby is fed, and there is a pleasure there and satisfaction, and the unconsciousness perceives the body being satisfied. And naturally, consciousness begins to say, hey, I am this body. At the beginning, consciousness doesn't know that it has a body. The baby doesn't know. But little by little, with this constant stimulus, consciousness begins to say, hey, this is my body. I have this body. I can move my hand. I have emotions. I have a mind. And there is an identification with these bodies, with this vehicle of consciousness. So we generate the idea, this consciousness that originally is a spark of the divine, generates the idea, I am this person. And then all the problem begins. I am this person that is separate from the rest. Now, as you know, the physical body needs to be maintained, needs to be fed, needs to be protected from illnesses. The physical body hurts and needs to have rest. So when consciousness begins to identify itself with the body, then it begins to experience suffering and pleasure. The same with the emotions. Emotions can be hurt, or emotions can be made feel good, and the same with the mind. So by identifying itself with all these external aspects, consciousness begins to know joy and sorrow. Because the original consciousness is beyond joy and sorrow. In the Eastern religions, they talk about bliss, a state of perfect peace, harmony, which is beyond, happiness and suffering, pleasure and pain. But that is not the case of the vehicles of consciousness, of the body, the emotions, and mind. They live in the world of pain and happiness, or sorrow and joy. So since consciousness is identified with this, it begins to experience this. Consciousness has this amazing ability to identify itself with things. We watch a movie and we get identified with the actors there, and we suffer with them or are happy with them, and we know they are actors, but we still reproduce those feelings. And that is necessary, otherwise compassion, sympathy could never happen. We need to be able to identify and resonate. And I think that's just the result of the fact that all consciousness is one. So consciousness, this seemingly separate consciousness, is responding simply to itself, that is in the other person or object. But anyways, the idea is that consciousness identifies with the body and all that, and then begins to suffer. Now, the process of evolution implies two things. Basically, this consciousness has to be able to express through all the different kinds of matter without losing awareness of its true origin, its true nature. The difference between a Buddha or a Christ and us is that when they take a body, they retain the memory of who they really are. We take a body and we forget. But then the essential nature of the Buddha, the essential nature of the Christ, is exactly the same as ours. That's why St. Paul would talk about the birth of the Christ within us, because that's the same nature. The difference is that they are not blind as consciousness, they are not blinded by matter, they have learned to retain this memory, and we don't. So Plato used to say that when the soul incarnates, passes through a river that produced this lack of memory, this amnesia. And the soul forgets who the soul really is and begins to think that it's a body. So one of the purposes of evolution is to be able to express itself through all these levels of matter and still retain the consciousness of its true nature. So let's put the true nature of consciousness. The other purpose, which is just the other aspect of this, is that in order to be able to retain this consciousness, these vehicles of consciousness have to be reorganized, reshaped. For example, we receive a body at the evolutionary level from the animals. In science they explain physical evolution goes from mineral and vegetables and then animals, and then one animal develops a body good enough for the mind to begin to awaken there. So basically we receive a body from the animal kingdom. Now this body from the animal kingdom is suited to survive in a forest. So that's why it has these instincts of survival and aggression and this and that, because that is necessary for an entity that is in the forest and that doesn't have a mind. Now we human beings have a mind, and we inherit this body, and we have to reshape this body to serve the purposes of the human experience. So we have to tame the body. We cannot relate to each other as animals do in the forest. We cannot just go and kill somebody and eat that person. So we have to reshape this body. The same happens at all levels. So consciousness not only has to be able to express through matter, retaining the awareness of the true nature of consciousness, but also it has to reshape the different bodies or dimensions so that they can express consciousness properly. So the idea of being incarnated is to be able to do these two things. So now in the second part of the talk, we will explore briefly the different experiences in life from this point of view. So for example, let us see the role of suffering. Why is there suffering? Well, first we said that it's kind of inevitable, because as soon as consciousness needs to be expressed through a physical body, the physical body needs what we call suffering. If we don't suffer when we touch the fire, then the body would get burned and the incarnation would be ruined. So there has to be a mechanism where the body can identify this is not good. So nature produces this idea. Whatever is not good for you, for the body, will have an alarm, which is what we call pain. So anything that the body encounters that is not good for the body, the alarm to consciousness is the feeling of pain. Now the same happens at the emotional level. Whatever is harmonious with the emotional body is translated in consciousness as joy. And whatever is inharmonious is translated as sorrow. And the principle is the same. There are things that kind of affect the functioning of the emotional body. And the same with the mental body. So if we are going to keep a structure, physical, emotional, or mental, that structure, because it is a structure, can be damaged. And therefore, there has to be a system of alert so that you know when something is producing a damage. So inevitably, when consciousness has to use a material vehicle of expression, we'll be in touch with suffering. Now the main problem, is that consciousness is identified with the suffering. Because that adds, some people make a distinction between pain and suffering. So the idea is that pain is just the objective feeling or sensation in the body, and suffering is what the mind produces with that particular pain. For example, if we are practicing a sport that we really like and we are climbing, a wall, and we fall, and our body hurts because we fall, but we are excited, we know that this is fun, and the pain doesn't matter. But if we are walking to our work and we trip and we fall and we hurt ourselves far less than we hurt there, our mind gets completely, upset, and then we generate a lot of suffering from something that objectively was the same or less than when we were having fun. So the mind many times interprets something that is objective and adds sorrow or suffering to the pain. Enlightened beings, they use a body That body also undergoes pain when something is wrong, but because they understood deeply, they realized deeply that they are not the body, that pain is seen as something completely objective. There is not psychological suffering. And that is possible for all of us. But that comes as consciousness has this experience and begins to realize all this. It's just like watching the movie. When we get too absorbed in the movie, we start suffering with the actor. And then we may snap out of it and say, hey, this is only a movie. And then suffering is reduced. It's the same with, relatively speaking, the same with our human life. When we are absorbed in the idea that I am this physical body, the suffering is far more than when the person realizes its own nature as a soul or a spirit, and that the body is just a vehicle that is momentarily using to express on the physical plane. So suffering is inevitable, especially at the beginning of evolution. But it has a purpose, a very important purpose. Because one of the problems that we talked about with this process of embodying a consciousness is that since this consciousness is awakened by the outside world, that consciousness is constantly focusing on the outside. And as the consciousness begins to discover the outside world, it begins and it identifies with the body, it begins to get attached to whatever produces a pleasure to the body. Also, whatever produces a pleasure to the emotional body or to the mental body. So consciousness begins to search for happiness through objects, physical objects or emotional objects, so to say, or mental objects. If there were no suffering, consciousness would be constantly looking outside and would never turn inside to realize its own nature. But because no external object can really produce happiness, they can produce pleasure, they can produce temporary joy, but they always turn into suffering in some way or the other. So because of this very nature of the universe, as consciousness goes on in the process of evolution, little by little begins to get tired of the external objects. At the very beginning of evolution, to have many wives, for example, consciousness could think this is a way to be happy. Then to deal with all those wives is not easy, so consciousness says, no, I will have only one or none. But no, it's just a joke, but the idea is that the process is that we start accumulating things, and then we realize that these things are not really giving us happiness. And with experience, life after life, consciousness begins to say, not again, not again. I went through this. I made all this effort to acquire this, and I know it's not going to be satisfactory. Because essentially, consciousness, which is eternal, can never find satisfaction in anything that is transitory, in anything that is transient, that passes away. The only real happiness can be found by something that is eternal, can be found in what is eternal. So in life, all the suffering that we encounter, even though we may not realize it, is teaching consciousness what is real and what is unreal. And in the Theosophical view, after the physical life finishes, there are processes after death where consciousness can study the whole life and assimilate the lessons and understand much more than what we normally understand in life. Of course, when we are in the spiritual path, the idea is that all this process of assimilation is done in life, and then we grow much faster or evolve faster. But that is one of the aspects of suffering, that suffering begins to to help us let go of the illusion of what is not eternal. And as we let go of all that, we begin to realize that we have to look inside. And something similar with illnesses. There is a story in India, for example, the god of death. In India, they call it Yama, which means cessation or death. There is a myth that says that human beings were in this kind of paradise, just like in the Christian, paradise before the original sin. So human beings were happy there, but they were in this kind of unconsciousness, animal-like consciousness. So this god of death, or the angel of death, was so sad because of this state of human beings, because they seem to be happy, but they are really a divine spark, and they were imprisoned in a body with such a little joy, with such a little experience, with so much that they could be. And the angel of death really felt compassion and pity for humanity that was in that state. And his tears, when they fell into the earth, they became illnesses and misery. So the illness, the misery, the suffering is the outcome of the compassion of the god of death. Now, if you interpret this, the god of death represents the god of anything that finishes, that is temporary. Anything that can die is something that is not real. The real, from an ultimate point of view, is eternal, is indestructible. It never changes. Anything that changes is because it was not the ultimate reality. So the idea is that the God of change, the God of the transitory, gave humanity a blessing in disguise, which is suffering and illness, because by this means now humanity, at the beginning, humanity was eternal in the physical body, in the myth. Same with Adam and Eve. They were eternal there. It was only when they were expelled that they began to know hunger and death and all this. But by doing this, the angel of death allowed humanity, or gave humanity the opportunity to realize, I am not this body, I am much more than this, I am far beyond. That would never happen if everything was okay, with that little life, little conditioned physical life. So illness, again, is part of the process, and again, even though we may not realize it in our normal consciousness, the soul learns that it is useless to get attached to the body. We need to take care of the body. We need the body to express ourselves while we are alive, of course. But to get attached to the body, to live for the body, is useless. So eventually, consciousness begins to use the body as a tool and not as the purpose of life. If you see modern Western philosophy, there is a lot of theories about the purpose of life that are based on the body. They are based on making the body happy. And by the body, I mean also the mind and the emotions that come through the body. So that is the state of blindness where we think that happiness can come by trying to feed the desires. Now, there is a saying that says trying to satisfy a desire by giving the desire its object is like trying to put out some fire with gasoline. Because every time that we satisfy a desire, that generates, it's like the Hydra, in the Greek myth. You cut the head of the Hydra and then 2 or 3 more appear. And then you cut the other and 2 or 3 more appear. That's the nature of desire. The more we satisfy desire, the more desires are produced. So the more mouths are there asking us to feed them. So it's a circle. And this is why people who have all the money, and meaning the means to satisfy their desires, many times they get to the point that that they are completely haunted by this. And they start doing stupid things because there are so many desires, and the more they satisfy them, the less they are happy. Of course, there is a field of needs that need to be satisfied, but the needs are different from the desires in this sense. So the experience of sorrow and illness and all that, again, helps the soul to discover its true nature. And then happiness is also a guide, because we start learning through happiness. The soul begins to learn the difference between happiness and pleasure. At the beginning, happiness and pleasure is the same. And in our culture, for the most part, it's just the same. So we think happiness is whatever produces pleasure. There is a little truth there, because the sensation of pleasure is the result of something that is good for the body, for example. But the problem is that we draw the conclusion, this little thing, little amount of this produced pleasure. So if I increase the amount, I will increase the pleasure. Now, the maximizing of the pleasure begins to be wrong, and that produces suffering. So for example, a little sugar is good for the brain, and it produces this sense of pleasure. But too much begins to affect the body, and that produces an illness, for example. So what we do is that our minds see that something is good, and we tend to go to the other extreme. So you see that there is always this idea of more. Being healthy and having a good body may be necessary, but then we draw the conclusion that the more muscles or the more this or that, then the better. Or with anything that you think in life. You know, having a house is good, but then we draw the conclusion that then having a bigger house and more cars, and more, we will be more happy or happier. So the maximizing of pleasure turns into the opposite, into suffering. And consciousness begins to see this and begins to understand that whatever brings a more lasting joy is whatever comes closer to the middle path, beyond the extremes. This is a skill that consciousness learns, and consciousness learns by, going from one extreme to the other, one extreme to the other, until at some point begins to understand how this works. So also, the problem with pleasure is that pleasure may be the result of something good for one part of our constitution, but that part or that action may be bad for the rest of our constitution. We are very complex beings. We are not just a homogeneous being where something is good for the whole thing. For example, there is this debate I just read in the newspaper, in The Guardian, that in England they were saying, there were some newspapers that were saying drinking one bottle of wine every day was very good for health. And they are supposed to have some scientific backing to this. So in The Guardian, they were questioning this, and they were saying that the scientific backing wasn't really good. And they were saying that most of the researchers saw that a little of wine could be good for the body, but not more than just, I think it's a glass or something like that. Now, from a more esoteric point of view, something may be good for the body, may make the body last longer, but that may happen at the expense of the emotional or the mental health, not necessarily with one glass of wine. I'm just bringing this example in the sense of something may be good for the body, but may be bad for the soul. And we know that. That's the basis of many religions and philosophies. So something that brings pleasure to the body not necessarily brings pleasure or happiness for the whole human being. It may be very good for the body, the animal aspect of our nature, but be bad for the soul, and therefore that will produce suffering. Or the opposite, something may be bad for the body, or relatively bad, And that may be good for the whole human being. Just like in a surgery. A surgery is something that our body doesn't enjoy, and there is a lot of pain there. But that action is good for the whole organism, hopefully, if the surgery was necessary. So again, pleasure and pain, as a general rule, can be seen as a signal of what is good for that particular aspect of our being. But since human beings are much more complex, we cannot draw the conclusion, as some philosophers did, that the more pleasure, the happier you are, and that the purpose of life is to attain more and more pleasure. And there were important philosophers saying this, even in the Greeks, Epicurus and the hedonists, and they had very reasonable arguments. In their proposal, they were very philosophical, but they lost sight of this complexity of human beings and the traps that are there. So to conclude, the idea is that when we see human beings, life is complex in itself. If we want to understand anything in life, we need to study a particular science. If we want to understand the purpose of life, we need to understand many things. Some people may not need to understand the purpose of life. There are religious people that if you say you just have to surrender to the divine, and they don't need any explanation, and they will do what they have to do, and all this effect will be produced whether they know it or not. But for them, it is enough to lead the right kind of life. But for most people today, and especially in the West, but the East is getting more and more similar to the West. So for many people that have the need to understand, and that a partial understanding of life makes us take some paths that are not healthy. So for this kind of people, we need to try to understand life from a holistic point of view. And there are several elements. This understanding is attainable. It's not that it's something, completely beyond our grasp. And as we try to understand life more and more, we develop the ability to see behind the words, behind the teachings, behind the allegories that we use. And then, as we understand life, we naturally fall back into the right way of living. And not right in the sense of what the church says or what the government says, right in the sense of what my consciousness feels is the way to live. So whenever we encounter, or as we go through life, let us try to remember all this. Let us try to remember that suffering has its purpose. It's never pleasant, by definition, but it has its purpose. So when we understand this, we can try to go through it without or with less resistance. When we go through illness, we can try to understand that is part of the process. Even if we don't see it, even if we don't understand it completely, we can accept it as a blessing in disguise. Not that we will like it, not that we will be happy with it, but the understanding will help us go through this with a state of mind that is more suitable to understand the process. It's just like a kid. If we try to explain or to make a kid do something, if the kid just cries and we have to drag him, it's very difficult for him to understand what we are saying, what he should do. If he could listen and try to watch and not resist, he could learn faster. So it's the same with us. If we can go through the experience of life, joy and sorrow, illness and health, with this perspective, with a more open mind, we will develop much faster the ability to really see all this, the ability to naturally feel life in this way. And that is the way in which we can reduce suffering and begin to feel the natural happiness, which is the true nature of our soul. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And now, as we normally do, is there any comment or questions?
Can you talk about how to choose pain and suffering to help lift the burden for humanity?
Yeah, there is another concept that since we are all one, everything affects everybody. Just like the atmosphere. You know, if I contaminate or pollute the atmosphere, I'm not polluting my atmosphere up there, you know, above myself. I'm polluting the atmosphere of the whole world. So same with any violence that goes on in our personal life or in the world, that all goes into the general emotional dimension of humanity. And that dimension is constantly influencing each one of us. And every time that we go through suffering with understanding, we are also producing, let us see it as a kind of energy, let's say in that way so that we can visualize it. As we go through suffering with understanding, we are producing a kind of energy that helps the whole humanity also. So the idea of Jesus dying in the cross for our sins is a symbol, or at least that's how I see it, is a symbol for this fact. Each one of us, by trying to lead the right kind of life, is taking a little or helping a little to lift the burden in the whole humanity. So when you are going through a difficult time, try not to see it only from a personal point of view. Why is this happening to me? Try to see how this is part of the process. If you can go through the difficult time with the right frame of mind, that will produce more strength, more poise, more wisdom in yourself. But also, that is affecting the whole humanity. No act is a personal act. Every act, every thought, every emotion is a collective or has a collective effect. So that may help you and inspire you to know that you are actually helping a little to everybody that is suffering so that they can also go through this with that frame of mind.
We have a question online. Could it be that the purpose of our lives is to fulfill God's desire to share the glory of His existence with others? Yeah,
you can interpret this that I was talking about, the Logos, perfectly in that sense. There is a divine consciousness, this God, that when all these little seeds of consciousness, what we could call our souls, have really the potentiality of God. And here, depending on what branch of Christianity you belong to. In the mystical view, the souls are a little fragment of God. So essentially, they can become one with God. And the idea of sending that soul through the experience of life is so that soul can realize its divinity. Now, as I said, in Christianity, I have never seen an explanation of how going through the physical life is going to produce that in the soul. I mean, if you know Theosophy or you know these explanations, you can infer that from the teachings. But usually they don't explain, the purpose in that way. But yes, I would agree with that statement completely from a Christian point of view.
There may be most likely a simple answer. The pairs of opposites seems to be what we learn the most. If there's only one way of looking at it without an opposite, so there has to be pairs of opposites on this physical plane.
Yeah, consciousness is based on consciousness as we know it, not this pure consciousness, but consciousness as we know it is based on duality. When something is always the same, we stop perceiving it. For example, if you leave your hand without moving, after a while, you don't feel anymore the table or whatever you are touching. Consciousness needs change to perceive. If there is a smell, that is constant. After a while, you don't sense the smell. So the way that consciousness works intrinsically depends on duality. That's why pleasure and pain, myself and the other, day and night, all these things are the way consciousness not only relates to the world, but also the way consciousness interprets the world, seeing the duality. Eventually, when that consciousness realizes its own nature, that dual perception disappears in the sense that can be understood, but it's not the way consciousness perceives.
You talked about that spark of consciousness being enveloped in various bodies, and that the goal is essentially to deal with those bodies in such a way as that you are aware of your divine spark. In that dealing with your bodies, isn't there some sort of transformation that goes on in the bodies? Some sort of change? And then how does that affect the one or the divine spark, since everything is, from in the one?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's why I said that part of the purpose of evolution is to reshape these bodies. Consciousness and matter are actually two aspects of the same thing. So what goes on in consciousness always is reflected in the matter, and what goes on in the matter always reflects itself in consciousness. So, but it seems when these two aspects are described, usually consciousness is like the active aspect, and matter is like the passive aspect. Now, matter again has its own consciousness, which is the active within the passive. So let us not go there. But generally speaking, you could say that consciousness can affect matter, or always affects matter. And as consciousness develops the right view, it develops the right kind of vehicle of expression. Now, we are talking at the level of this duality. The higher we go, the closer we go to the pure consciousness, the less apparent this duality is. But at the level of the one, there is not real change. It's like the example that I gave about the gold. You can reshape the gold in many ways, and you may have beautiful things made out of gold. The gold itself never changed. Now, as I said at the beginning, I don't know if I said that, but when we ask these questions, we can try to ask the questions as deeply as possible, but we can never ask the question in an ultimate sense, in an absolute sense. Like absolute answers or ultimate answers cannot be put in words, because words belong to the world of the relative. So many people ask, why does the one that, if he never changes, manifest the universe and all these seeds? Those kind of questions can never be answered, at the intellectual level, at least. They can be experienced, but they cannot be answered. So yes, at the level of the one, nothing changes. At the level of the many, there are very important changes.
What about is this working?
Mm-hmm.
What about the idea that the purpose of an incarnation is to have the experience of a human being? Mm-hmm. And the purpose of your incarnation is to have the Pablo experience. And that's the purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, as you get closer to the true nature, there is less and less purpose, in the sense that, for example, in a very selfish person, the purpose of the love that person may feel for his or her children, no matter how selfish and limited, you can say the purpose is so that this person takes care of the baby, otherwise would dump it there. But as the person evolves, love doesn't have a purpose anymore. Love, it just is, and it's the way things are. So as consciousness gets closer to its true nature, the purpose in life is just to experience life. But before that point, consciousness experiences life always, but for the most part, let's say at the beginning of evolution, it messes up. It produces more and more suffering. So I wouldn't say that to say that the purpose of a murderer is just to be a murderer is the purpose in itself, because it doesn't make much sense. Although,
unless consciousness wants to experience what it's like to be a murderer.
Which is what happens.
And a murderee, both sides of the...
Which is what happens. I mean, consciousness needs to go through that. And at that point is what consciousness has to do. Now, if we see from a wider perspective, it's not what consciousness wants, ultimately speaking. It's what consciousness wants, given the circumstances, because that's what will allow, it to realize its true nature eventually.
I was raised Catholic, and they always taught us about Armageddon. And I didn't know if I believed in it even when I was a kid, but the older you get, if you pick up a newspaper, it does seem like wickedness, or whatever you want to call it, is a progressive. And if it's like a snowball rolling down a hill, something got to give, right? I mean, no matter what. So a lot of what they do, even though I don't agree with the way they say it or what they do, but it does seem to make sense.
Yes, that's because we need to understand this motion of evolution. Usually when we think of evolution, we think that it's a progression like this. So if we are evolving, as time passes, we should be, if this is goodness, and we are evolving to goodness, and this is time, as time passes, we should be better and better and better. Now, that's not how evolution works. From the theosophical point of view, evolution works in this way. So the idea is that consciousness begins in a spiritual state, it goes down to its opposite, and then comes back to a spiritual state with experience gained. Just like Michelle mentioned in the last talk, it's like the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. The son was in the house of the father, but he was there, it was a given. He was there because he was born there. And he wasn't aware of the goodness of being in the house of the Father. So at some point he says, hey, I want to go to the city. I want to experience the world. I'm bored here. So he goes to the city and gets away from the Father, experiences, suffering and happiness and this and that. And little by little he realizes, you know what? To be at home was what I really want. I was okay at home, but I realize it only now. So then the prodigal son comes back home, and you would say, well, he just wasted time because he was already home. Why did he go to the world and now he's back home? But there is at home, there was another son. And this son gets really upset when the father sees the prodigal son coming back. He organizes this party, and he was so happy. And this son says, hey, why are you paying so attention to him? I was always here with you, and you are not, happy that I'm here, and he's returning after leaving you, and you are so happy. Because this son that was in the house is still at this level of evolution, symbolically speaking, where he can be tempted by the world. At any moment, he too may say, hey, I want to see the world. I want to know the world. But the prodigal son, having experienced the world, is not going to be tempted anymore. He had the experience, and then he says, oh, I know the world. The world is there, but I'm done with it. So there is a fundamental change between these two sons. So consciousness, in the same way, needs to go through a point of conflict before it realizes that the true way is the way of love or peace or this. Well, in the Theosophical view, where all the different cycles are explained, we are at this point, we are at the bottom, and that's why it seems that violence and selfishness and all this is increasing. But the idea is that this is a temporary stage. How long it will take, it depends on ourselves. It depends on how intelligent we are to go through this and learn as fast as possible. But eventually, we will realize this is not the way. We have to come back. Something like what happened with consumerism. You know, now you have a lot of people that they say, let us go back to a simplicity, to a simple life. Before we had a simple life, then we cluttered everything with things and objects, and now we are realizing that the simple life was necessary. Well, that's how this works, usually, the process. So even though we see that the world seems to be, getting more and more aggressive, in the Theosophical view, that doesn't mean that we are going back or going to destruction, but that is the necessary teen years of humanity, of the spiritual soul, before we realize the truth.